Hello there. Welcome back to Conversations in Sustainability, your podcast exploring the biggest environmental, social and governance issues shaping Australia and the world. I'm your host, Dr. Lisa Portland. Cox-Inall Ridgeway is a social change agency committed to disrupting disadvantage in Indigenous communities. Established in 2007, Cox-Inall Ridgeway was born of a partnership between Gumbaynggirr man and respected Aboriginal leader, Dr. Aidan Ridgeway, and Managing Director of Cox-Inall Communications, Tim Powell. Their goal is to facilitate and enable strong and durable relations between Indigenous peoples, governments and corporations through the range of work they do. Importantly, Cox-Inall Ridgeway seeks to achieve meaningful outcomes. Yatu Widders-Hunt is the General Manager of Cox-Inall Ridgeway, a communications and media consultant with some 20 years pioneering social change and communications within the Indigenous landscape. She's a descendant of the Anaiwan and Dungari peoples and has spent her professional career fusing her interests in Indigenous storytelling, communications and community building, crafting a career as an authority in the First Nations art and communication sector. Welcome, Yatu.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yatu, you've had an extensive career in the First Nations communications and social change space. Tell us a bit about your background and what led you to become a communications practitioner.
Yeah, I think I've always really loved communications and storytelling, and it really started growing up in quite an activist and academic household. So my parents, I grew up with an Aboriginal father and a non-Aboriginal mother, and they were both very involved in the social justice movement. So I was taken to a lot of rallies as a child, and that kind of sparked curiosity around how social change happens. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't really interested in law or other systems, and I thought communications is really how you get to, win elections or convince people of certain things or drive change in a meaningful way. So, yeah, I grew up, decided that after university I wanted to get into public relations, but wasn't that attracted to consumer PR. Yep. So I didn't really know where to go. Mm-hmm. I was watching a lot of West Wing, went to Canberra, thought, this is where I'll learn how things really work. Yes. So I did a long time in Canberra and then came back to Sydney and kind of focused more firmly on the First Nations space.
And so, Yatu, you would say that, you were really interested in that social change element. What do you think are the critical elements involved in social change?
There's a lot of kind of critical elements. Is really around ongoing education and awareness of really understanding issues from a lived experience perspective. And I guess, as we've seen in recent times in Australia, a feeling of being unafraid to actually talk about things that might bring discomfort or make people feel a little bit confronted. And I think, we have a bit of a history in Australia where we're not really loving the vibe about talking about those things, but bringing those things to the forefront is actually really important if we're going to drive change from that point.
And so what changes have you seen in the First Nations communications domain across the last decade?
I think there's been quite a lot of change because I think when I first started out as a communications practitioner, particularly in the government sector, it probably wasn't as top of mind as it is now. There wasn't as high a level of appreciation or understanding of the diversity of Indigenous communities, communication needs and preferences, and also the intelligence that lives within First Nations communities around communications and tapping into harder to reach audiences and content creation partners and remote radio networks and all of these things that really add to the vibrancy of the First Nations sort of communications ecosystem. So I think certainly I've seen clients and stakeholders really building an appreciation and building it into tenders, building it into their approaches and drawing from community intelligence on those issues.
And how would you say that First Nations communications differs from, for example, what we would call nominally a mainstream audience or a called audience?
Well, I think a lot of the approaches we take in a First Nations communications sort of sphere do actually work for everyone. They're quite human things. So I think relationship building is really at the core of effective communications. So, we don't kind of just dip in and out and come in with big announceables and then go. It's about an ongoing and always on relationship building and trust building process. I think it's also an area where the diversity of the community can actually mean that there's some really creative approaches to things. So we've worked in remote communities where we've partnered with radio networks who have created comedy shows to promote a particular issue, but in a more metropolitan area on the East Coast, it's perhaps more event-based to reach people at a particular gathering. So I think just really being more place-based and designing with the communities on the ground is really impactful. But yeah, as I said, I think if we take that approach to broader communications, I think we can see how well it does for everyone.
So let's turn our attention to The Voice. And when did we vote on The Voice? It was last year or
2023. Yeah.
2023, which was, the pinnacle, I guess, to some degree in terms of a lot of things within this sort of space and a lot of disappointment as well. What impact do you think The Voice had on the way organisations incorporate First Nations communication and change within their business?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think, from a personal perspective, it was a very disappointing time, the failure of that referendum. And I think we saw organisations and businesses respond really differently to how they engaged in the process that led to The Voice, how they engaged in the public debate around it, and how they're reacting now. I do think, on a positive note, I think a lot of organisations are reflecting on how they embed voice in their systems and processes. They know this is what the communities have asked them for. Disappointingly, that wasn't achieved at the national and the constitutional level. So I think for organisations that have reconciliation action plans and commitments in this space, I think a lot of them are thinking, well, how do we actually embed, if we say we support this principle, then how do we embed it beyond just consulting people on projects? How do we build it into our governance, our systems and processes? How do we listen better? So I think that's actually been quite a positive thing.
So just touching on that, in the lead up to The Voice, there was a lot of, coming from my end, and I was internal at that point in an organisation. There's a lot of communication around The Voice and what it meant in the lead up to the referendum. And then post-referendum, there was really a drop-off and a bit of a vacuum in terms of, what that meant and the impact on staff. And I think in particular for people that, were experiencing a level of grief around that, there was just no sort of communicational outlet within that space. Is that an accurate reflection, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think at times it was a little bit, interesting to watch as well, because there was a sense from some organisations and peoples that, I certainly felt that it was a bit of an attitude, well, that's resolved or that's over, without an appreciation of the fact that the sort of fight or advocacy for social justice and better outcomes is an ongoing thing across our lifetime. The Voice was not an isolated thing. It came off the back of more than decades. We've been fighting for justice since invasion. It was a pivotal moment, and it's certainly not the end point in terms of the advocacy for better outcomes for our communities. So I do think, that was quite interesting for me to observe that, they did feel like sense, we can't talk about that now because it was resolved, but the issues it was aiming to address are actually not resolved. And so we need to, keep focus on how we're going to achieve better health outcomes, better participation, better economic benefit sharing, all of those things.
So let's turn our attention to social license, which is a bit of a buzzword this year and has been in previous years, but has certainly garnered a lot of traction. What does social license mean for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's a term, as you say, that's talked about a lot in different circles. I mean, I think in a First Nations world, we might use terms like cultural license as a way to sort of articulate what these sort of concepts mean. And I guess for me, it's really about building trust and principles of working in partnership with communities where you are delivering things, where you are aiming to drive change, where you are perhaps coming into someone else's space. It's really about getting that back to some of those First Nations principles we talked about: relationship building, trust building, benefit sharing, or co-creating, all of those things to give you a platform and the sort of, cultural license to be able to operate in that way, in that place.
And Yatu, we had you at a social license event a while back, and you referenced a particular book and a series of principles that were really fascinating for for the people at the event. I'm wondering if you can resurface that.
Sure. Yeah, it was a book that I read by an Aboriginal academic called Tyson Yunkaporta. It's called Sand Talk. I know he's written other books, but in the book, he references a couple of principles that he does acknowledge came from, I think, a community member or perhaps an elder, which are respect, connect, reflect, and direct. So it's really about building respect for an issue or an people, connecting with the lived experience of that issue, then reflecting together. And then directing activity, where we see in kind of a more sort of Western business or government approach, we go direct, we're going to do something, we need action now. And then sometimes that's not particularly efficient because you haven't involved the people, you haven't built an understanding of the issue, you haven't taken time to consider what that means. So we've seen all kinds of things, sports centres building communities that didn't actually need sports centres because nobody asked them. So just waste, disruption, and in a sense, a level of disrespect for the communities that are there. So I think if we flip the way we normally do things, or we might be trained to do things, that's a really good way to approach projects and processes.
Yeah, and it is kind of a very tricky space because, we've obviously, there's this real influx of this idea of co-design and meaningful stakeholder engagement, but at the same time, how meaningful is it exactly?
Yes.
When would you suggest to pull the plug or not participate in co-design or stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, I think, as you say, when it's not genuine. So a lot of the activity that we see currently that is perhaps called co-design is actually just consultation.
Yeah.
So a lot of decisions get made by clients, by business, and then people go out and say, is this okay? We're going to do this. Is this okay? That's consultation.
Yes.
Or sense checking almost. It's not actually co-creation or co-design. So, co-design is really engaging people at the absolute outset of a process to inform key decisions and bring their expertise to shape the project.
Yes. Yeah.
Rather than design everything and then go ask people. And that's not to say that there's not a place for consultation, but we just mislabel things quite a lot, I think, in modern practice.
Yes. And do you have any projects where you think this co-design has been done really well and the ideas have been woven intrinsically into the project, into the outcomes, I should say?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's been a process where I've gone, nailed it. Like that's 100% it. But there was a project, I probably can't name the project, but it was where community were actually consulted or engaged prior to a decision being made on whether the project was even going ahead. And a lot of people go, oh, that's so risky. You're just raising expectations. You're just doing this. But it was actually such a good process because the community bought into it early. They felt respected in the process. And also that client had an idea that should they go forward, they knew who they needed to talk to. They knew what engagement approaches were going to work best. They knew what cultural considerations might need to inform the way a tender was written. those kinds of things that would never have been heard had they waited till they, decided and then went, okay, we're doing this. So I think, that's a good example of where it's never too early to engage. And communities are really savvy and sophisticated to how governments and broader business works. So I think, a lot of the risks are our own fears rather than realities.
Yes. And so speaking about co-design, but also a lot of new concepts that kind of capture popular opinion and communications theory and even academic theory. So everything from co-design through to post-human new materialism, etc. A lot of them really hinge on Indigenous principles from 60,000 years ago, right?
Correct.
Kind of relabeled and rebranded. How do you feel about that? How do you educate people to say this isn't a new concept? You haven't split the atom. This has been around for 60,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a time, obviously it's hard at times because people are presenting things as their own ideas or new ways of doing things when they're actually quite ancient ways of doing things.
Yes.
So I think there is a real place for more education and awareness of how First Nations thinking can drive a lot of the things that we are doing and facing. And the book that I spoke about, Sand Talk, I think it's actually called Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. Because, I work a little bit in the fashion space and people go to sustainable fashion conferences and talk about sustainable fashion as if we've just discovered it or it's the answer. And you've got Aboriginal fashion designers going, it's just Aboriginal design. We actually have expertise in this country of how to do these things well, but there's sometimes a disconnect between groups. We're not actually tapping into that expertise in the ways that we could be.
Yeah,
which
right.
is also exciting because we haven't yet explored all of the ways we can do that.
Yeah, so let's turn our attention towards your involvement in First Nations fashion, which has been for over a decade or so now. And you've really shone a light on First Nations fashion, surfacing influential designers, models, stylists. Would you passionate about First Nations design?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of found it by accident. I mean, I don't think anyone who went to school with me would think that I would end up in fashion. I was a connoisseur of Kmart for a long time in my teenage life. But I kind of came across it as when I was working as a freelance journalist because I thought, you know what, this is another area of First Nations excellence we haven't talked about in this country in to the degree that I thought we should be. It's also something that's really fun and accessible and celebratory. A lot of people connect with it. They love fashion. We're all intrinsically connected to clothing and style and all of those things. And it was just one area at that time in my life that I thought I can actually talk about issues that I care about, that community cares about, but through a really celebratory and engaging lens. And so, I started an Instagram page to showcase the excellence that was happening, and people get really excited and it makes them curious and they ask questions and then they learn more about art styles, communities, the geography of Australia, where people are living, different business models, all of those kinds of things. So for me, it was an exciting pathway to have hard conversations.
So it's kind of like an easy or accessible pathway for people to start having bigger and more important discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a microcosm of, one vehicle. We can start doing that. But it's also an exciting industry and a fun industry and one that I personally love and engage in. And I think it's great to acknowledge also the contribution of First Nations peoples to the industry as well.
So tell us a bit about some of your favourite First Nations designers and why.
Oh, it's so hard to pick. But, I'm a big fan of Mara Collective.
Yes.
They're a New South Wales-based resort wear. They make gorgeous dresses. I think you even have a Mara piece from memory. Yes, you do. You love that.
Loves that.
It's a beautiful, beautiful label. I love Nagali as well, Melbourne-based label, also works with other Aboriginal artists. A lot of silk, really love that. And I love Leandra Swim. I think, that's like it's really vibrant. Leandra's from the Northern Territory. The art styles are really different and unique, and it's colourful and it's fun and it's great for the beach. And I just think, yeah, they're probably the three that I covet the most, but there's a lot of other amazing designers out there doing children's wear, men's wear, tailoring, all kinds of different things, but bringing a really cultural perspective to the way the business is run and to the product that's produced.
And I suppose it's probably a bit of a tricky space sometimes too, in terms of how, mainstream designers work with Indigenous designers, the appropriation of different artworks, or it's not really appropriation, it could be termed stealing. Like how do these, how can this be done ethically as well in terms of these different collaborations that happen?
Yeah, for sure. It is a big issue, and we've seen that in the Indigenous visual arts sector as well, the level of cultural theft that happens. Yeah. There are some great resources out there. There's great organisations like Arts Law who provide guidance on how to do this well. There's been some really great examples, like Gorman did a collaboration with Munkaja Arts a couple of
I have a piece from that too. You do these with
So we're all into fashion. I've moved on from Kmart days. But there's some really good templates in terms, and they're and Spell have done a great collaborations with Kylie Caldwell and have actually shared how they did it so that people can learn from that co-design experience as well. So I think, just ensuring I would go to experts. There are amazing lawyers, ICIP lawyers, and also industry bodies that provide guidance on how to do things well so that we're not exploiting and people are sharing, in the benefits that are created.
And so what kind of changes have you seen in the fashion landscape across the last 20 years or so, and what are the next steps?
I think there's been a real joy in watching people discovering what's going on in the First Nations fashion sector. I think a lot of people just haven't been aware of all of the different businesses, all of the different art styles, all of the different labels that they can buy from and that they can wear as allies as well. I think that's been exciting. Even in the last 10 years or so, we've seen Aboriginal models back on the cover of Vogue, back in Marie Claire, being really celebrated for the contributions that they're making. Runways at Australian Fashion Week. It's only been the last few years we've had these runways that really elevate the work of the designers. In terms of what's next, obviously, I hope there's more growth in the sector. There's more international opportunities for these designers. But I also think back to the point around First Nations thinking that there's more collaboration on addressing a more sustainable fashion industry. Because there are designers who are working and living on country, who are running commercial businesses in ways that are more sustainable than we've seen. And I think we have a lot to learn, and we can actually together redefine what the Australian fashion industry is. And we can actually lead the world on these things.
Okay, so you have been interviewed around some interesting academic work that's been done in the PR space in terms of, incorporating First Nations thinking from a PR perspective and also through a gender lens. Can you give us just, a bit of an idea around that particular work and how PR can be shaped by a First Nations lens?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has gone back to how we imbue cultural principles in the approach. So it's around pitching differently. It's around building out campaign ideas differently. So even in the business I work in, it's quite, we kind of walk the line, because you don't want to go into a pitch or prepare an idea and presume to know what's going to work for Aboriginal communities. So we talk a lot more about process and principle. So this is how we're going to find the answers. This is how we're going to ideate with community, rather than going and go, agency knows best. This is how we're going to PR this idea. It's more around how we're going to work together to identify how to do this.
Yes.
So I think even those small but significant changes can actually reshape the way traditional agencies work to drive better outcomes with the communities they serve, whatever the community is. So I think, that's kind of been the kind of at the crux of a lot of the conversations I've had when being interviewed around this work is how we build those principles in a business context. Because it's hard because we get briefs, we get pressure, we get, the need to deliver on KPIs, but we can't do any of that effectively if we're not working in partnership with community.
You've been with Cox-Inall at the forefront of Cox-Inall Ridgeway for over a decade now, if I'm right.
I've been there 9 years.
Yes.
Yeah. And in this role for the last couple of years.
Yeah. How does your work impact social change from a First Nations perspective?
I guess we work across lots of different industries and with lots of different communities. We like to only work on projects that we believe are contributing to driving social change. So I think, we consider the type of work that we want to do. We consider who we like working with or whose values aligned. And I think part of it is, at the very outset, considering whether your values aligned with a particular project or client or sector. And then I think the way that we work is really a big contributor in terms of building those partnerships, active listening to community, and co-creating solutions together is actually the way that we create a lot of the impact. Our ownership structure is also quite unique. We have a trust, a First Nations employee trust, so First Nations staff and Aboriginal organisations can also financially benefit through the business model we've created.
And so for organisations out there who have not been involved in the First Nations space but want to engage, what would your recommendations be in terms of how to do so appropriately?
Yeah, there's lots of ways we see organisations start in the RAP program, for instance, setting up reconciliation action plans that are meant to guide their learning and their social impact as well. There's also a lot of power in building relationships with Aboriginal people, whether they're in their sector or in the communities that they work in or the cities and towns in which they operate. I think we see a lot of people feeling like there has to be more of a science to it or what's the checklist or the approach to doing things. But I think just starting, reaching out, asking questions, building friendships, educating yourself is really a great way to start. And there is a lot of nervousness around not doing the wrong thing. But we often say, in our business, you can't always be right, but you can always be respectful. So it's just an attitude.
Yes.
Like when we go, even as people with Aboriginal background to other communities, we're on someone else's country. So we're going through the same thing. We're building relationships from scratch. We're asking questions. We might feel a little bit awkward, but it's just human connection and knowing where you are and having the confidence to go, I'm going to be open-minded and vulnerable and find out.
Well, thank you so much, Yatu, for sharing your insights, your thoughts and your background from such an extensive career within the First Nations space. We hugely appreciated having you on Conversations in Sustainability. Thank you so much, Yatu.
Thank you for having me.